From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome to All Things with Kim Strassel. The Trump administration is rapidly overhauling huge pieces of the federal government, and joining us this week is a cabinet secretary who sits at the intersection of many of those pieces. Former North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum is the new Interior Secretary. Already a huge post in that Interior manages the vast amount of our federal lands and resources. But in this administration, Interior is also stepping up its role in policy areas like energy and housing. Secretary, welcome.
Kim, great to be with you.
How is Big Bad Washington treating you? It's probably not as friendly, I'm wagering, as Bismarck.
Well, it's been a fine start and been very fun to be here, been very focused on all these issues that you've described. And of course, Interior, very exciting and honored to lead this incredible organization. If Interior was just a standalone company, it would have the largest balance sheet in the world, 500 million acres of surface, 700 million acres of subsurface, and 2.5 billion of offshore acreage to manage. So whether it's across the Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Parks, Bureau of Indian Affairs, there's so many important issues to address across the department. So the issue set is super fascinating, and we're making great progress on all fronts.
Yeah, I think it's something a lot of people don't realize is the range and scope that Interior covers. What a central department it was all the way from the founding of the country. And since you mention its size, a lot of that is obviously the people who run it. And it's been in the news. Let's just cut right to the chase on this question of the size and function of Interior Department. Lots of headlines about cuts and staffing. I think when you came in, Interior probably had about 70,000 employees. But how many have been cut, from where? What do you see as the right size for this department under this administration's goal of making government more streamlined?
Well, I think, Kim, for me on this task, having stepped in as governor of North Dakota, elected in 2016, and then 2 weeks later, the legislature started, and we had a $1.7 billion deficit on a $6 billion general fund. We had to cut 27%, and we were able to actually cut that. I was coming straight from the private sector into my first elected office as governor, and it turned out it wasn't that hard, in the sense that at a state level, you've got to balance the budget and have things have got to balance out. The federal government, hasn't done this for sort of forever. And there are so many places where we can actually reduce the burden of the cost of government. The big picture is $2 trillion underwater. We were spending 2,000 billion more last year than we brought in. That's completely unsustainable for the debt and this fiscal deficit. So there's lots of things. And when I think about it, take national parks, for example, out of that 70,000 number you mentioned, more or less, I think the number, and I say I think because there aren't great IT systems here, about 26,000 people in the parks, but I'm trying to get a hold of the number of people that actually work in the parks as opposed to work in a regional office or work here in Washington, D.C. And there, of course, there's always going to be some shared services roles that are outside the parks that make sense efficiently. But like any organization, if you were in a position of trying to deliver better services for your customers and do it at a lower cost, you'd figure out a way to get rid of the overhead at headquarters. You'd get rid of the overhead at the regional offices, and you would put more people in those customer-facing, in this case, visitor-facing. So I think we can end up with, for example, fewer people working for the national park system, but actually more people working in the parks, whether it's plowing a road in Yellowstone or interfacing with any visitors at, the wonderful national parks we have in Alaska, across the West, across the territories that we serve from the Pacific to the Caribbean. Big opportunity for better services for the citizens and lower cost for the taxpayer.
So it sounds as though you're still trying to come to grips with how many people there are. I was just curious about that question, though. Like, do you know how many have been cut or what the goal is?
Well, we don't have a specific goal in mind. The goal is to make sure that we're doing a great job at the tasks that we have, the missions we have. And so there is no specific headcount number that we're targeting. What we're targeting is the right balance between revenue and cost. I mean, we're Interior, which could be named the Department of the Exterior, because most of what we do has to do with land management. We can't be cutting people that are out there when we've got a backlog of getting grazing leases for people in the West. Our country, through overregulation, has literally crushed the mining and the timber industries in our country. And from a mining standpoint, relative to critical minerals, we've really put ourselves in a tough spot versus China. But much of that work on mining and timber and grazing would happen in the western part of our country, and it would happen on public lands. And we're so backlogged on getting permits. There was an active effort of the past administration, the Biden administration, to not permit grazing, to not permit timber, to not permit oil and gas as part of a belief and an ideology around climate extremism. And so we've got work to do on the revenue side of Interior as well, because if we can get our systems, our processes, and our people working, whenever we issue a permit, the customer, the taxpayer, whoever's harvesting the timber, grazing the cattle, or developing those minerals, they send a check to the federal government.
Right.
They're the customer. They send checks to us. And part of what we have to do to balance the budget is to get our revenue up. And right now, when you take a look at the asset side of the balance sheet of the federal government, we all know that we've got $36.5 trillion of debt, because we talk about it all the time. Both parties talk about it. The debt, at least every 4 years we talk about it. But no one ever talks about the asset side. And part of it is because there isn't a good balance sheet here in Washington, D.C. You can't go to one spot and say, what are all these acres worth? What are all these subsurface minerals? What's all the offshore worth? There's uneconomic decisions, or where economics has completely been left out of the decisions made by the Biden administrations, where they're taking entire swaths of offshore, exceeding the limits of the Antiquities Act, and essentially creating wilderness areas which blocked development. All of those had a financial cost to our children, our children's children, because we were essentially wiping assets off the balance sheet. I think the balance sheet on the asset side far exceeds that debt in the trillions, much, much larger. But then if you looked at that and you'd say, okay, if we're the largest balance sheet in the world, then Interior is the worst performing property manager in the world because our returns are so low.
Well, you make a really valuable point, which is that this was also the vision, the one that you're laying out, of the folks who first really got federal lands going. And I'm thinking here of the vision from Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the Forest Service. And that vision's laid out on the Roosevelt Arch in Yellowstone, where it talks about how national lands are meant to be for, quote, the benefit and enjoyment of the people, end quote. And there seems to be a view among progressives, they only look at the enjoyment part. And even then, not so much, because they also want to lock up land so no one can even enjoy it to go in and use it. But the benefit side seems to have been cast. They don't want to deal with that. And this administration and what you just laid out seems very much about re-embracing that notion that these lands are there and they can be a profitable asset as well as a place that people can enjoy. Talk a little bit about some of the biggest steps you've made so far to reverse some of those lockup orders that Biden issued, and what your goals are in terms of leasing and energy development and other things like grazing and, as you note, both onshore and offshore.
Well, Kim, first of all, I'm smiling and enjoying the fact that you understand the original vision of these public lands. I mean, these lands belong to the public. They don't belong to some federal bureaucrats that are unelected. They belong to the public. And as was Theodore Roosevelt at the center part of that, when he talked about conservation, his definition was sustainable use was the benefit.
Yep.
A forest is better if it's being managed and maintained than if you're harvesting. I mean, we've burned more forest in this country in the last 20 years than the board feet of timber we've harvested. And in the process, we've released countless amounts of emissions that the progressives say that they're against. And so again, if it's good for the environment, it's good for financially, it's good for the public, it's good for employment, it's good for rural communities that are involved in these natural resource industries, whether it's grazing or whether it's timber or whether it's minerals. All of those things, benefit the American people. And he actually said that conservation is as much development as it is preservation. It's both of those things. And so anyway, you're spot on that. And we're trying to get back to the original mission. But things that we've done already, I mean, the most egregious one in the last weeks of Biden administration, with the stroke of a pen, he said we're going to take 625 million acres of subsurface offshore and just say it's never going to be developed. Did that with an executive order. I mean, that's 1/3 the size of the lower 48. And absent any discussion about the balance sheet, when he did it, either people can't comprehend the scale of 625 million acres, which is hard because it's a big number and People don't,
It's huge.
don't think of acres, in terms of, oh, that's 42,000 plus square feet. I mean, they don't think of it that way. There wasn't ever an article that was said, wow, he just wiped out, 10 trillion or $20 trillion of future revenue, whatever the number would have been from developing. I mean, if you could develop a third of the United States, what's that worth?
Right.
So with President Trump did an executive order instructing me as secretary to take the action. And so we've unbanned the ban, so to speak, on that particular thing. That was one of the biggest ones, but there's lots of unwinding to do because even in the final weeks of the Biden administration, they were, hustling to try to achieve this ideology of locking stuff up, as you say, and not really for the benefit. And some of the stuff, these wilderness areas, part of the reason why the fires are so bad, there's not even 2-track roads to get in. Firefighters can't even, use a wheelbarrow. A wheel is considered, mechanical. You can't have a bicycle or a wheelbarrow. How are we supposed to fight fires in these areas? So there's just some common sense we have to get back to as well with our guidelines and regulations.
Can you actually reverse some of these decisions? There's some legal debate over that, given the way that Biden proclaimed them off limits.
Some are very easy. In the offshore acres, in the case, I think we've effectively reversed that without any issue. In the case of the use of the Antiquities Act to create national monuments, there is some debate about whether that can be undone or not. But remember, when that law was signed by Theodore Roosevelt in 1906, the actual language says that it should be the smallest possible acreage to protect the objects. I mean, this was meant as kind of an Indiana Jones, protect, the cliff dwellings, collect the site where we're going to do the archaeological dig. And when you start encompassing entire regions with millions of acres into national monuments, and again, this was done at the end of the Obama administration, at the end of the Clinton administration, at the end of the Biden administration. This is when most of the lockups have occurred. This is when most of the overreach of the antiquities laws occurred in those 3 presidencies in the last 25 plus years. And, I think if you're locking up millions of acres in Utah, as Obama did, that's probably more than the smallest possible acreage to protect the object. I mean, I think any court would see it that way. So again, it's the overreach, and there is a legal grounding to shrink the size of these back to what the enacted purpose of that law would allow.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, more with Interior Secretary Doug Burgum. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel here with Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum. It does seem we're headed for some big court fights in this administration, some of them overdue. So I'm actually happy to hear that. Can you talk to us a little bit about the National Energy Dominance Council, which obviously was this new council set up by Donald Trump? You are the head of it, the chair, meant to foster more agency cooperation on issues of energy. But how is that working in practice? Some people might hear that term and think, oh, well, it's another council. What's it doing that no one has ever thought of doing before in the federal government? What's its role and what's actually coming from it?
Well, thank you for that. And first of all, this was a great piece of leadership by President Trump because he recognized that the Biden administration was using the whole of government to shut down U.S. energy. They were using, rules across the SEC, the EPA. They were failing to, support sanctions that had been supposedly enacted, either through Treasury or through Commerce or the State Department, which is why a place like Iran was, even though they were, quote, sanctioned under the Biden administration, they still sold between $200 and $300 billion of oil. We went from 5% of the world's fleet being a dark fleet to 25%. Iran was selling discounted oil to China. China was refilling their strategic petroleum reserve at a time when Biden, before the midterms in 2022, he drained ours in half. All of that manipulation was done, like we're going to ignore the sanctions, we're going to drain the petroleum reserve. All of that was done by the Biden administration to try to manage price at the pump at home. Venezuela, you can start producing oil again as long as you promise to hold free and fair elections. I mean, they did everything they could to increase the world supply and look the other way on bad actors, at the same time aggressively trying to shut down U.S. energy development. I mean, if you're a resident of Alaska, you would know more than anyone that there were 68 executive orders against Alaska under the Biden administration. They sanctioned Alaska effectively better than they did Iran, and shutting down all of these resources that we've talked about that belong to the public. And when they were doing all that under this ideology of climate extremism and also the political support that they thought they were getting from people around that, when they were doing that, they weren't doing anything to reduce supply. They were reducing supply of the U.S. They weren't doing anything to reduce demand. The demand was still there. So if we shut down U.S. supply, then it's replaced by foreign supply. And the U.S. supply happens to be, the cleanest, the safest, the smartest, the healthiest development of energy of any place in the world because our regulations are so high. So they were actually hurting the world environment at the same time they were pursuing these goals. And so your question, the National Energy Dominance Council, step one for us is just to start unwinding this whole of government approach. And that's why on that council, we have the Secretary of State. So Marco is on there, Scott Besson from Treasury is on there, Howard Lutnick, Pete Hegseth from Defense, Brooke Rollins from Agriculture because of our biofuels. Chris Wright is the Vice Chair, our fantastic new Secretary of the Department of Energy. He and I spend time on this every day. We have a small tiger team of about a dozen people that are working, and we're not writing, a 100-page paper on the benefits of deregulation. We're working directly with President Trump and his senior team, and when we're getting projects done. And those projects that whether it's the 800-mile Alaskan LNG pipeline, which he mentioned in his State of the State, the only infrastructure project he mentioned, gives us an opportunity to sell U.S. energy to our friends and allies in the North Pacific, or whether it's figuring out how do we get the Constitution pipeline built from Pennsylvania into New England, which was blocked by the state of New York and Governor Cuomo multiple times over a water permit. Costs 4 times as much for LNG in Maine as it does in Pennsylvania, just less a couple hundred miles away. And we've got all kinds of citizens that have the 6 New England states effectively have been put into an economic poverty island because they have to pay more for their electricity prices and more for their gas prices because we were not able to move our own clean U.S. energy around our country. So that's another one we're tackling is the Constitution pipeline. But there's a whole list of things that we're taking on as actual projects and coming at it almost like a governor would in a state from an economic development standpoint. What do we have to do to help the private sector? What permits do we have to get for them? What legal battles can we go to battle with them as opposed to against them to accelerate their permitting? And then through that experience of actually getting stuff built, we will then start to figure out how to streamline the burden of the regulatory environment, which is choking every American industry.
Related question, and a word that you've now mentioned numerous times, and that is permitting. And the thing is here, I've been covering Washington a long time. Everyone has understood forever that we need legislative permitting reform. And there is some more serious talk about doing that, finally getting there, because you have to be able to address some structural problems like those that are built into the National Environmental Policy Act, which activists and green groups have learned how to use very effectively to shut down permitting and projects. How much can you actually accomplish from a permitting perspective and streamlining without that kind of legislative fix?
Well, thankfully, President Trump declared an energy emergency on day one, and that energy emergency gives us some abilities and some authorities to be able to expedite processes, pursuant to that executive order. So we can do that. But I do agree with you, Kim. I think there is an opportunity. Every state, every member of Congress, every senator has to realize that they have companies in their states and in their districts which are choking under this amount of regulatory overlap and overreach. It sort of does 2 things. You need 13 EISs for a single bridge. I don't think we need to do that to people. And then we've also got the overreach, which is some of those unelected bureaucrats now in court are being challenged is that some of the rules they've been making maybe don't have the power of law. If Congress wants to have that heavy of a regulatory environment, they should pass those laws. So there are court challenges where things like from the Council of Environmental Quality, that CQ, a number of things that they've done over the years that added a burden. Federal court ruled just recently that none of what they've ever said may actually be effective as law because it's treated as law when in fact it isn't law.
Fascinating.
So we're going to do 2 things. But in December of this last year, in the last Congress, Manchin and Barack Strasso, the two senators, Wyoming and West Virginia, bipartisan, got very close. Some of those ideas are still alive, and I know there are members of Congress picking them up, and I hope that among the things that get accomplished within the next 18 months is we get some regulatory reform on top of the projects that we're expediting through the NEDC.
We're going to take one more break. When we come back, more on all that's going on in the Interior Department under this new Trump administration.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is All Things with Kim Strassel.
Welcome back. Kim Strassel here with Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum. I could talk with you about all of this all day. We're beginning to run out of time, but I do want to ask you one last question here because it's an area I think is fascinating. You also wrote about it recently on our pages. You have teamed up with Housing and Urban Development Secretary Scott Turner to create a joint task force to look at the possibility of using some federal land to increase housing supply. This generated, as one might imagine, screaming headlines about the Trump administration selling off national monument land to build skyscrapers. I don't think that is probably the vision. Can you talk a little bit about what you would like to see happen here, what you think might come out of this?
Well, I'm again smiling, Kim, because the predictable examples of things that'll never happen as the reason not to do something. But as you know, all of these acreage we talked about, like to start with the 500 million acres of surface, most of that is in the western part of the U.S. And in some western states, we've got federal land that abuts right up to the city limits. And in many cases, those are fast growing cities. And take, Las Vegas and Clark County, take everything from, Salt Lake to Ogden. These are states where, like Alaska, that are really trapped under federal regulation because of the amount of public lands. Utah is over 80% federally owned.
Right.
The things that other states could just do, which is, hey, we're going to grow our cities and have affordable housing. They're trapped in part by federal regs. In Utah, we just about last month, Spencer Cox, the great governor there, and I were able to conclude an exchange. This was set up as part of legislation that was passed in 2019 during the first Trump administration, or the John Dingell Jr. Conservation Management Recreation Act, locally known there as the Emery County Land Exchange. But we were able to exchange state land for federal land. Utah picks up water rights. They pick up subsurface minerals. They pick up 4,000 surface-only acres. They pick up a bunch of things there. And those parcels, then they can use to do state-managed energy development, which is going to have lots of potential
good point. Yeah.
For them to do that. But then what we got out of that deal is we received over 116,000 acres of checkerboarded state lands, much of what was inside areas that had already been deemed wilderness, that had already been, set up to be protected, the kinds of lands that we want to protect forever from development. And so that filled in the checkerboard for the feds, but it opened up the opportunity for the state. And one of the things the state, of course, can also do with that is use some of those surface lands for adding housing and growth. In southern Utah, there's a specific law that dates back to Harry Reid when he was a powerful Senate Majority Leader, called the Southern Nevada Lands Act. More appropriately, it's kind of the Clark County Lands Act. But the BLM owns a bunch of land in Clark County, and we still have, under that legislation, we still have got acreage that could be moved to help relieve some of the high prices and congestion there. But broadly, we're going to keep looking at this for land exchanges. We did an analysis. I don't know if it's been done before, but we've got something like 160,000 acres that are in 1 to 3 miles of cities in America. Those would be the piece that we'd start looking at right away. That can do a lot in terms when we're talking about adding housing. But again, when you take that amount, 160,000 seems like a big number, double it to 300,000. It's still not even, it's like 0.00 of all the land we manage in the country. So no one should be concerned about us exploiting the public lands. But if we have an opportunity to get land back into the hands of states and let states manage it as opposed to the federal, that's also a way for us to reduce costs, because all of these states they've all got their own department, environmental quality. They've all got great fish and wildlife departments. They've all got state parks and rec people. They've got all of that. So part of the redundancy is if we give land back to the state, I know as a governor, it's going to be managed by people that live there, and they're not. It's going to be managed by people that are living thousands of miles away.
Yeah, people who live there and people who care too. That's also something that people forget.
Exactly. Nobody cares more about the land, the water, the soil health than the people that live there because they're there. They've got their kids, their next generation, their grandkids. Exactly.
Secretary, we want to thank you for giving us so much time today. We hope down the road, after you've managed to make some of this happen, you'll come back and talk to us again.
Well, would be more than happy to do that because exciting things happen across the country and lots of exciting things happening in your home state of Alaska, where close to half of Interior's resources are in Alaska, and Alaska can really be the key. And that's why President Trump created a separate executive order about unleashing Alaska's potential.
Yep.
And I've met with multiple folks from the Alaskan Native corporations and also from tribes around the country, including some of our largest, like the Navajo, and the tribal communities and the Alaska Native communities are very excited about the opportunity for economic development that comes with smart, sustainable resource development.
Well, as we like to say, north to the future.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. We also want to thank our listeners. If you enjoy the show, please hit that subscribe button. We are here every week. And if you feel like writing to us, you can at atkim@wsj.com.